Welcome, everybody. Welcome to week 3. All right, what's the goal of all Christian instruction? Worship. Yes, the reason why we do all of this is because we want to worship the Lord. And so you guys hop into your groups. Pretty big tonight, so I'm thinking 4 to 5 groups, but you guys decide. And I want you to answer this question. How have you seen God change you from the inside out over the years? Not your behavior, but something internal. Less anger, more goodness, less fill in the blank. So how have you seen God change you from the inside out? Hop in your groups. Make sure everybody knows everybody's names. We have some new folks in the room. So make everybody feel really welcome. Grab a drink, snack, and then I'll interrupt. Why do y'all think I asked this question?
Well, isn't the Sermon on the Mount all about changing from the inside out?
Yeah, you've heard it said, don't do this. But I tell you, are y'all really grateful God changes the inside? Because how many of y'all have been in seasons where you were physically obeying, but on the inside,
you're standing up.
Yeah, you're not well. Yeah. Do y'all remember what the Sermon on the Mount is? Now, do y'all remember?
It's a portrait of Jesus.
Yeah, it is. It's a moral portrait of Jesus' own people. The morality for Jesus' people, though, is a lot thicker than skin deep. It's going to go below the skin. And that's a lot of what we're going to talk about tonight. And so, staying in those groups, I'm going to send you right back into your group time. Because we're going to talk a lot about passages that I believe have been used as weapons. And we misunderstand what they're actually saying. And so we tonight have to keep in the back of our minds always, this is a moral portrait of Jesus' people. This is not a weapon against people who have been harmed or people who, it shouldn't be a weapon ever. Now, the word is sharper than any two-edged sword. God can yield it and wield it however he so chooses. We just shouldn't be beating people with the Sermon on the Mount. And so, keeping that in mind, hopping right back into your group. When have you seen someone yourself obey the rules, but they're ruining the spirit of the rule? Or, so you can answer that, and you can talk about how much that annoys you. Like when the Astros are banging on trash cans. And you think that violates the spirit of baseball. Are y'all tracking with me? I'm just messing with y'all. I don't care at all. Okay. Or as a parent, aunt, and grandparent, how do you get after the heart of the issue? Because how many of y'all want to raise kids that don't lie, or how many of y'all want to raise kids who value honesty? Those are not the same thing. So let's talk about this. Pick whichever one you want, within the group or individually, however you want, but talk about this, about how this can sometimes happen, and maybe how you feel about that, or if you've ever been in charge of moral instruction, how do you get after the heart of the issue? All right. How much did y'all enjoy answering this question? Was it an enjoyable question, though? Like, did you find something in your, brain stem go, That bothers me. That bothers me when people do that. Anybody feel that way? Yeah. Who do you want to get a speeding ticket? What were they doing?
I'm speeding and someone passes.
When you're speeding and they pass you, you want to get a speeding ticket. Yeah.
I should have been going faster.
Did anybody answer the second question, or did you take the opportunity to answer the first? Because you're like, you know what, I do have a negative example.
Yeah.
Was your first instinct, you had an idea immediately with the first one?
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting? No? Y'all are more wholesome. You guys are too wholesome. Stop it. The reality is there is something in the human nature that when we see someone, they're not breaking the rule, but they're violating the spirit of what's happening here. It feels so unjust, doesn't it? And so imagine when God comes to the Israelites and he says, hey guys, I want you to be the kind of people that look like this. And they say, okay, but what if we don't? And he says, okay, well, you can sacrifice to me and that'll make atonement. And they said, great, we're not going to do that because we can make atonement. What does he say to those people when they do that?
I'd rather have your heart.
I hate your feasts. Cut that out. So it shouldn't surprise us when Jesus comes along and we get to this part of the Sermon on the Mount. So as a reminder, it's a moral portrait of the people, of Jesus' own people. Last week we talked about the Beatitudes, which we could really summarize as Jesus wants us to be people of humility, people of justice, and people of peace. This week, what we're going to be doing are what you might have heard people calling the antithesis, or, Jesus is writing a new law. They're really not new laws. They're extensions of the old laws, if you think about it. And so I titled this section, The Extensions. But there's a couple of important things we have to remember as we venture into this, because there's been a lot of ink spilled over the Sermon on the Mount. And one of the reasons why people get the Sermon on the Mount wrong is because they start with a bad framework. So they'll start with, Judaism is bad and legalistic. And so Jesus is kind of doing away with that. And it's like, well, literally he says, do not think that I have come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. This very section begins with, Jesus says, no, if you want to follow Torah, you follow me. Secondly, Jesus is very Jewish. Everything he says in this section, you can chapter and verse in the Old Testament, except for one, when he says, you have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemies. There's nowhere in the Old Testament that says hate your enemies. So when Christians are like, yeah, the Jews were told to hate their enemies, it's in the Old Testament. I'm like, no, it's not. And so he is quoting an axiom of their day and pointing out how loving your neighbor is not enough. But Jesus is thoroughly Jewish here, and he doesn't stop being Jewish on the Sermon on the Mount. So for the people who would say, this is the Sermon on the Mount is the new Christian way of doing things, therefore the Old Testament doesn't matter anymore. No. He's grounding all of this in the Old Testament, but he's doing what we're going to call fencing the Old Testament. We'll talk about why Jesus is allowed to do that, but we should be careful when we do it. The other thing you need to understand is the difference between statutory versus common law. This has created a huge problem in Bible exegesis. Up until really the 1900s, most law codes in the world were common law codes. In other words, you had a law and everybody understood the law was meant to give you the heart of what's going on. So if I come to you and I say, hey, if your oxen gets out and gores another person's oxen, you have to pay them 200 shekels. Everyone who understands common law goes, okay, so the law is if your oxen gets out and gores another oxen, you have to pay them back. The 2,000 shekels is just an estimate. If that was a prize oxen that you had, that has one, is like the best of the fold, maybe it's 3,000 shekels. If your oxen was 4 steps away from dying and the whole community knew it, probably the judge is like, pay him 200 shekels and he did you a favor, okay? Nobody read the law as that is the letter of the law till statute law came along, which is how America is run. We are a statute law. When you speed, what do they hand you? And it is if you go 5 over, it's one thing. If you go, which is why you want your cop to do what? Knock it down a couple, right? If you're driving without insurance, how much does it cost? You know how you know? You call the court. Doesn't matter if you've done it 4 times, it's a statute. You're going to pay the same thing. American law codes work like that. If you can find it in the rule book, that's the law. That is not how the Bible is understood. So when we read the Bible as statute law and go, this is exactly what's supposed to happen, and we don't push through the laws to see the value of the law and the heart of the law, then we misunderstand things. We have a lot of writings from the time of the Jewish people, and we have how they handled things. And they had all kinds of people acting on these laws saying, hey, yeah, so the law says this, so here's how we're going to apply it here. For example, if you catch your wife in adultery, it says stone her. Almost nobody was getting stoned for adultery. Instead, they were paying a big fine. They were saying the heart of it is, this is really egregious and wrong. But if you have this idea that the Jewish people were barbaric and going around stoning their disobedient children, that was not happening. And so even that story of Jesus catching the woman in adultery, most likely what scholars say is happening there is they're trying to catch Jesus. If he tells us to stone her, he's a barbaric. And if he tells us not to stone her, then he's too light on the law. So what does he do? Clever fellow Jesus. Okay, which one of you is without sin? You throw the first stone. Everybody agrees that story is just a trapping of Jesus. So when you think about these laws, you're going to read some things in them and you're going to go, ooh, that feels harsh. I'm going to say yes. Jesus is using big, harsh language because he's sketching a moral picture for us. So when he says, if you call someone fool, you're going to go to hell, that's not literal. But what he is saying is, if you're the kind of people that walk with me, you don't go around calling people fool. But if you grew up in the kind of church system that took the law literally, then maybe fool was one of those F words in your homes that you couldn't use. And, today, fool doesn't mean what, like, I don't know if y'all go around calling people fools, dweebs, silly geese. Just dweeb is such a good put down. Because it really doesn't do anything, but man, when you get called a dweeb, you're like, ah. Why did that hurt? I use it all the time. Yeah. I have a system of like when I'm doing theologian work for my master's students. And if I think there's like a bad actor theologian who's trying to harm people, they are buttheads. They get the highest level there. If they are not really bad actors, but I disagree with them, they're dweebs. And if I don't think they actually know any better, they're just silly goose. Like, that's kind of the, like, yeah. And so they always, are they a butthead? I'm like, I don't know, but they're at least a dweeb. And so, yeah. So again, Jesus is sketching a moral picture, and the weight of Jesus' words are meant to be felt. If you walk away from the Sermon on the Mount feeling bludgeoned, I would argue you read it wrong. But if you walk away thinking it has no call on your life, you also read it wrong. So remember, you need to be seeing Jesus looking back at you at this. Jesus does not bludgeon us, but he does call us further up and further in. So we're going to look at that as we go through it, and we're going to talk about it. So the extensions. In general, this is what Jesus says to start this whole section. He says, do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets, which, by the way, he's being accused of all the time because he does things on the Sabbath like heal. So people say, oh, he doesn't care then about the Old Testament. He goes, no. Do not think that I've come to abolish that. I have not come to abolish these things, but to fulfill them. So he comes to fulfill the Torah and the prophets. And then he says, I tell you the truth. Until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter of stroke of a letter will pass from the law until everything takes place. And so he says, hey, everything in the Torah is true. I'm not doing away with it, which is an interesting thing for Christians who say, oh, we don't have to pay attention to that at all. According to Jesus, we do. He says, so if anyone who breaks one of the least of these commands and teaches others to do so will be called least in the kingdom of heaven, but whoever obeys them and teaches others to do so will be called greatest in the kingdom of heaven. So he's saying, I'm not come to do away with the law. I'm telling you, everything needs to be obeyed. And then he says, for I tell you, unless your righteousness goes beyond that of the experts, that's the Pharisees, in the law, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. So your obedience must exceed the experts. And you're going, okay. What are we obeying should be the following question. All right, Jesus, you didn't come to get rid of the Old Testament, fine, because we kind of been accusing you of that because it feels like you play fast and loose, especially with the Sabbath. Feels like you play fast and loose with, like, I forgive sins. Only God can do that. And he's like, I know. That's what I'm trying to tell you. So he's coming and saying, don't assume I'm doing away with it. I have come to fulfill it, and we're going to obey every bit of it. You want to obey every bit of it. And he goes, you want me to tell you how? Here we go. And so that's where he's going to jump into. If Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament, then that means Jesus is the central story. We take Jesus with us all the way through the Old Testament. And following him means that you follow the Torah. And following him actually means following him. So when Luther read the Sermon on the Mount, he goes, this is silly. Like, who could ever do this? And when Bonhoeffer read the Sermon on the Mount, he says, no, I think we're actually supposed to do this. Both, trying to make sense of this, but we should be more righteous than those who do not follow him. Which is really interesting. Y'all ever meet people who have either no faith system or not the one that you possess and you think, man, that person's really good. Like, they seem really good. Do you do what I do, which is be cynical and go, I bet they're hiding stuff? Or do you do what Jesus encourages you to do, which is pursue righteousness even more? You probably are like me. I hope you're like me. Don't be like me. Don't do that. There's something interesting that Jesus is saying here. If you love me, you will obey me. This is what he's saying. And I'm not doing away with the law. No, on the contrary. But if you really want to fulfill Torah, then it's going to look like these extensions, is what he's going to say to them. So,
question?
Yes.
So, on your first question of the evening, is righteousness, what is the definition of righteousness?
Yeah, when Jesus uses it, he is talking about obedience to Torah, obedience to what God's calling you to be. So righteousness, when a Jewish person uses it, and Jesus is Jewish, it is how closely are you following what Torah is calling you to? Which is why when Paul says, according to righteousness, I was perfect. Now, you can sit there and go, that's crazy for someone to say that. Who among us would say we're perfect? Well, no Christian would, because we have a neuroses about the laws that the Jewish people do not possess. If you read Jewish writings, they're like, hey, we work pretty hard to obey this. Everybody makes mistakes every now and then, but we have a way to make that right. We're not too worried about that. You know why? Because they're not going around murdering. Which is why when Jesus comes along, he's like, well, I have a little bit higher standard for you than just don't kill your neighbor. Which is what he's going to talk about tonight. Because they're kind of violating the spirit of the world at times. But righteousness, and out of a Jewish person's understanding, is always going to be adherence to God's call on your life. Adherence, and specifically adherence to the laws of Torah. That's a great question, John. Thank you for asking it. So when you talk about the Pharisees and he calls them righteous, he's saying they obey the Torah pretty well. Which you probably have never heard that. But that is accurate. And they were very popular in the first century. So when he's saying you have to exceed them, the audience is like, that's a pretty high call because they're actually the ones doing it. But they're not doing it exactly how Jesus wants them to. And this is where this is going to come in. Yeah, Larry?
So your first question was about internal change and that's what I think Angela said that's what the Sermon on the Mount is about, is internal change. So exceeding the Pharisees, could we say that because God is changing us internally, we can fulfill all the law and what Jesus is saying in the Sermon on the Mount because we've been given grace so that we can see what someone else needs internally. And it brings us back to that community idea you brought up last week. Does that make sense?
Yes. And I'm hesitant to wholeheartedly agree with that because I think Jesus meant it when he said it, and he meant it before the Holy Spirit had been unleashed. So I think what he's trying to do is he's trying to paint a picture of you guys are the people, you are Yahweh's people. You are God's chosen people. And just like the people at Sinai, who, just like when the prophets of old came and had to rebuke y'all because you weren't obeying, you're still not getting some things right. And I'm after more than just your activities. Like, I went back to what I said, like, to teach your kid not to lie is not the same thing to value honesty. Because, like, some of the best liars I know are actually just strategically quiet when they have information to offer that they know is the heart of what's happening. And this is what I think Jesus is saying is, I want every ounce of you, not just your external behavior. And I would argue that some of the religious teaching of his contemporaries' day was very concerned about, they were concerned. It's not that they didn't understand internal things, but they had practices that revealed they weren't fully integrated in their heart and their activity. Now, in light of the fact that Matthew is writing after Pentecost, Matthew seems to understand there's a grace that enables us to live this out better than the people that heard it the first time. And so we are even less without excuse, is what I'd say. But I don't think he'd give the first listeners a pass. Patterns of the extension. Jesus is going to quote the Bible, and then he's either going to interpret it, extend it, or counter it. And then he's going to push beyond what God intended. He's going to say, here's what God was going after. You've heard it said, don't do this, but guys, you're missing the point. Like, we don't want you going around angry with each other. We're after more than just not murder. And people are like, I did great today. I didn't kill anybody, and I didn't sleep with the neighbor's wife. Crushing it. And he's like, we can do a little better than that. And then he reveals the intent and how we're to live. Some of the intent and how we're to live is hyperbolic in the first century. Nobody's leaving the altar to go make things right. They're at the altar. They're not. But he's saying, that's how important it is. You know how important temple sacrifice is? And they go, yeah, we sure do. It's written all over Leviticus and Exodus. And he goes, it's so important, you should leave that. And they're like, reconciliation is more important than temple sacrifice? And he goes, you betcha. Okay, it's hyperbolic. They're not actually going to leave their sacrifice. Or they might, I don't know. But the point being, he's trying to get them to understand the value of relationship. All right, so this is the pattern. Quotes it, either interprets, extends, and counters it. He pushes into here's what God's after, and then he gives us, here's how we're to live that out. So, this in Judaism is called building a fence around the Torah. This is what rabbis were already doing. This is why Jesus sounds just like a rabbi when he's giving this speech. So when you always go, oh, the Jews had all those laws, they're legalists. Well, you can say that, or you can just say, hey, they're trying to prevent crossing that line. The problem is, if you don't understand the original intent of the law, then your fence isn't going to work because you're going to miss the bullseye. So if I say to you, hey, we have a no rated R policy. Okay, we do not watch rated R movies. And then you go, great, we're not going to even drive by theaters. We're not going to buy popcorn because it makes us like movies. And we're not going to watch advertisements for it. And I go, hold on, guys, why do we have a no rated R policy? And then you go, oh, because it inspires us to be violent and sexual beings. I don't know, these are terrible examples, but you get what I'm saying. Then you build a different fence. We're not going to watch violent media. We're not going to YouTube violent and sexual media. Like, those are different fences. So when Jesus is building the fence, he builds a really good fence because he knows what the law is. And some of the fences that the Pharisees and the Sadducees built got away from the heart of the law. And so part of the reason why Jesus and the Pharisees are bumping heads is we call it halakhic interpretation. In other words, what's the halakha? How do you obey this law? What's the spirit of this law? How do you actually obey this Old Testament law? And they disagree on it. And you're going to hear huge disagreement in the Sermon on the Mount if you were aware of the Pharisees' teachings. One of the big ways, Pharisees are big on letting people divorce for any reason. And this is where Jesus takes big issue with the Pharisees, is going to be in the Sermon on the Mount. Okay, so this is the pattern. Murder. You have heard it said, don't murder, but I tell you, do not even be angry. So what's a better way than just not murdering? Let's get after it. And this is what I mean by hyperbolic examples. He says, hey, if you've got a sacrifice at the altar. Now remember, the Jewish festivals, massively important. They're not leaving the altar. But he's saying, this is how important it is for you to reconcile. You've heard it said, don't murder. And I'm telling you, you need to actively work on reconciliation. So let me ask you this. You get angry with somebody, you have two options. Option one, I can fulfill God's law by not killing them. Pretty good? How many of y'all feel like you're free to murder? I'm really angry at somebody. Option two, the way of Jesus, I need to go reconcile with them. I need to deal with my anger. I need to go and fix the relationship that's broken. Right? He gives the example. He says, hey, before you even go to court, go make it right. You might even be thrown in jail, which is like, I mean, he's being hyperbolic. He's like, hey, if you don't deal with your anger, you may go to prison. And you're like, Jesus, most of y'all are not going to prison, correct? Well, okay, there's always one. But the picture that he's painting here, right? Because again, most of us are not going to murder, and there are laws in place in a civic and social society that prevents that, right? And you have, in an honor-shame culture, you're not going around murdering anyways because you're not trying to bring shame on your family. And for most of us, we want what? Careers, retirement. We have external pressure to not murder. Do we have external pressure to get rid of grudges? In fact, it's kind of socially acceptable. It makes for good entertainment. How many of y'all watched a TV show that's about a grudge that people can't let go of, or anger, or getting back, or all those things? How many of y'all watch that?
Revenge dramas, you mean?
Revenge dramas. What is it? John Wick. I never saw it, but it's something about a puppy. I know they kill his puppy, and then he just goes and murders everybody. Yeah, so I would say John Wick is not a moral portrait of God's own people. Yeah, Larry.
I hope this isn't a tangent, but isn't this what?
It's Larry, he's talking, it's a tangent.
Isn't this what Paul is actually addressing when he talks about the Eucharist and us examining ourselves in relationship to the body?
Yes.
I never thought about that before, but he's actually
What's the new altar for Paul?
the communion table.
Yeah, and how important is it?
That important.
Now, how many of y'all have literally not taken it because you thought, how many of y'all, like, this is personal, so you don't raise your hand, but you feel like, I need to go talk to my roommate, friend, spouse, employee, and you walk. Because how important is reconciliation? So important. So here's Jesus. He's saying, I'm trying to extend for you. I want you to understand. Yeah, we said don't murder. Push through that. The reason why we said that is, one, it violates the image of the other person. They're an image bearer. Okay, so you shouldn't violate an image bearer. But do you know how else you can violate an image bearer? By harboring anger and hatred toward that person. And Jesus is saying, hey, there's a better way. And so when we get to the moral picture of Jesus, he's saying it's not enough for my people to not be just like physically violent murderers. We're trying to do better than Cain. So what I'm asking of my people are going to be the kind of people who, when they have anger, when they have broken relationship to the point that you would want to snuff out a life, when you have thoughts in your head that I want harm for that person, Jesus is saying, no, we go to them and we're reconciled to them. And you want to know how important it is? Leave the altar. Stop what you're doing and go find that person and be reconciled to them, because it is that important when you belong to me that those are the kind of people we are. That's the murder. Then he says, okay, let's talk about adultery. You've heard it said, do not commit adultery, but I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to desire her has already committed adultery. These are strong words. Now, does that mean every time someone confesses lust, you go, adulterer, right in their face? Please don't. And then he goes on, if your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. Does he literally mean that? No, these are part of the hyperbolic examples that he's given. Please don't harm your body. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better to lose one of your members, that is sexual entendre right there, than to have your whole body go into hell. He's risque. You've heard it said, don't take another man's wife. I say to you, don't even look lustfully at a woman. Now, I want you to understand what's really happening here culturally. Are men the only creatures who lust? But who are the only people being addressed in this passage? Very interesting.
Power.
Yes, in the ancient world, women were considered responsible, nothing's changed, for preventing lust. And men wrote about how women should dress to prevent men from lusting. And Jesus says, do you want to know what it looks like to be my people? You can't just not sleep with her. You actually have to not lust after her. And he says nothing about the way women are dressed. Now, do I think it's morally responsible for women to not dress in a certain way? Sure, to whatever extent that the Lord is calling you into that, I think that is love of neighbor, all of that. But Jesus is very clear that he knows what he's doing here. Now, what's interesting about the right eye, he specifically names the right eye. In the ancient world, the right eye is synonymous with power and privilege, because men were allowed to sleep with any woman that wasn't married to someone else. That was considered socially acceptable. And Jesus is talking in a culture, that's not even adultery, and we'll talk about this. Like, adultery is something different in the ancient world. To commit adultery in the ancient world for a man, the only way he can commit adultery is to sleep with another man's wife. He can sleep with a slave. He can sleep with a single woman. He cannot sleep with a daughter of a man. Like, if a woman is still under her father's home, that is also wrong. You cannot do that. And there were scholars, or not scholars, there were authors of this time that say, hey, if a woman commits adultery, she should be put out and shamed to the nth degree. But if a man commits adultery, she has no right to even touch him in her frustrations. So even then, he's committed adultery, but it's not as big of a deal as if a woman commits adultery. Now, in the Victorian era, we continue to talk about women as if they don't have sexual desire, which is bananas. But this is part of the ancient belief. Now, Jesus is talking to the one who has more power here. And he's saying, you need to lay aside your privilege and your power. And not sleeping with her is not enough if I'm going to paint a moral picture of what it means to be my people. And so people read this and like people always go, lust is the victimless crime. It's like pirating movies. Y'all remember this? Y'all remember? Some of y'all are too sharp. We used to watch VHSs. And on the VHS, there was an FBI warning that said they were going to come to you and find you if you pirated that movie. Did anybody ever get a knock at the door from the FBI? And they said, there are no victimless crimes, was what the thing they said. And I thought, stealing from Hollywood seems like no big deal. So I just wasn't technologically savvy to steal anything. So people might go, really, lust? Like, you're not really hurting anyone. This is what people say. Now, first of all, the pornography industry is built upon exploitation. So if you're talking about porn, you are so far beyond the pale of understanding exploitation. But this is what Bonhoeffer says. He says, discipleship is self-denial and a complete bond with Jesus. At no point may the disciples' desire-driven will take over. because our bond to Jesus Christ permits no desire without love. The problem with lust is there is no love attached to it. And desires without love, as James, the brother of Jesus, says, desire gives way. And it will overcome you. This is what God says to Cain. Hey, you need to master this, or it will overcome you. And so controlling your desires is a better way than lust, right? And so Jesus is saying, hey, adultery is not the bar, fellas. Now, do I think he'd be talking to women too? Yes. If Jesus wrote the Sermon on the Mount today, I think it would be men and women. I don't think, depending on where we're at in the world, if we're in America. But what he's saying is listen, if you want a moral picture of my people, then we don't treat others as objects of our sexual desire. Because sexual desire has to be tied with covenantal love. That's how it's intended to be. So we just don't go around desiring other people, because that, again, paints a picture of the image bearer in a way that is not in keeping with reality. And then he goes on to perhaps the most difficult part of the Sermon on the Mount, because people do not do their homework, is he says, it was said, whoever divorces his wife must give her a legal document. So that's the quote from Deuteronomy 24. But I say to you, everyone who divorces his wife, except for immorality, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. The better way here, you've heard it said, don't have a divorce. What Jesus is saying here is what I'm saying to you is you should have a rugged commitment to your spouse. The Pharisees of Jesus' day, in Deuteronomy 24, it says, if you're going to divorce your wife, you give her a certificate of divorce, you can divorce her for any reason because she is no longer pleasing to you. And the Pharisees said, great, pick a reason. And rabbis had a debate. Some said, if she burns your breakfast. Now, some more honorable rabbis go, no, she has to have an affair. You can't just be divorcing women. But by the time of Jesus' timing, divorce was rampant. And what Jesus is trying to say is, listen, God ordained marriage in Eden as a lifetime commitment of oneness. And the scriptures declare unequivocally that God hates divorce. But, and this is a huge but, Moses permits divorce for anything displeasing, and the contemporaries of Jesus were playing fast and loose. Dale Allison, who's a brilliant New Testament scholar, he says the impression one gains from ancient Jewish sources is that divorce was relatively easy and was not considered a grave misdeed. And Jesus is saying, I know what Moses said. And later in the book of Matthew, they're going to be like, well, why are you saying we just can't get a divorce for any old reason? Because that's what Moses said. In other words, are you really more important than Moses? If Moses says we can get a divorce for any reason, why are you saying otherwise? And he says, hey, Moses only gave you that because of the hardness of your heart. This is not how it should be. You should have a rugged commitment to your spouse. Now, in the ancient world, the average age of the married girl was about 14, marrying a 30-year-old. Those are not the same age, the same maturity, the same anything. The rugged commitment to spouse that we have today, hopefully most people marry somebody at least somewhat in their age group, somewhat in their stage of life, somewhat in this realm to where you would hopefully see each other as equals. Men did not see their wives as equals in the ancient world. And they didn't have a rugged commitment to their spouse. And Jesus is saying, you guys misunderstand the purpose of that Deuteronomy 24 passage. And even then, the Deuteronomy 24 passage was, most of the time, the woman stayed in her husband's household as part of a polygamous marriage. Very painful for that woman. So if we go back to this idea that Jesus is painting a moral picture, you could use this passage as a proof text. If you choose to use this as statutory law instead of common law, you can walk right up to people who have been the victims of abuse, who have been the victims of adultery, who have been the victims of abandonment, who have been the victims of people who have chosen to broken the covenant, and you can go right up to those people and use it as statutory law and say to them, you have no grounds for divorce. And that would be very foreign to Jesus. He'd say, this is not a weapon. This is not a proof. This is not even how you're supposed to use the Bible. I'm painting you a picture of rugged commitment to your spouse. If a partner is breaking the covenant, they're unrepentant porn use, they're abuse of any kind, they're adultery, etc., then that partner broke the covenant. What we do to people is somebody's already broken the covenant through their behavior, and we go to the one who is the victim of that, and we say, you have no grounds for divorce because of the words of Jesus. And I'm telling you, if Jesus were here today, he'd go, that's not how you're supposed to use my words. And so what we have to understand is if you're going to paint a moral picture of God's people, rugged commitment to your spouse, and this would have been wild to the people in the first century. The men would have been like, what? You mean I can't divorce her because she burned my eggs? And he's like, absolutely not. But we have weaponized it for far too long and missed the whole point. Rugged commitment to marriage is not the same thing as rugged commitment to your spouse. And what happens too much in Christian circles is a partner understands that the church has a rugged commitment to marriage, but not to the people within the marriage. And often there is a perpetrator in the marriage who has no commitment to their spouse whatsoever, but they're trusting that the institution of the church is going to hold up their marriage. And they point to the words of Jesus, which is even far more egregious when that does not reflect the Jesus that many of us worship and love. And so the Sermon on the Mount, first of all, by the time Paul comes along, he expands this even more. Because Paul's dealing with things in cities, and he's going, hey guys, it's not only, adultery, but it's also desertion. And it's also, and go ahead, if they leave, go ahead. And he's allowing for even more provisions, permissiveness, so to speak, to divorce. And so here's the corrective for some churches. If somebody's coming to you and they're saying, I want out of my marriage, and they're coming to me as a pastor, and I say, why? And they say, well, some things just don't work out. Oh, no. That is not the moral picture of the people of God. You get your butt back in there, you work harder. If somebody comes to me and says, my husband doesn't love me, he is unrepentant in his abuse, he has already forfeited the marriage in every way, but he's standing on the words of Jesus to say, I cannot leave him. As a pastor, I can point to 1,000 other places in the Bible that helps that woman get free of that, or that man get free of that. And so we, as the people of God, have to be better Bible exegetes. But more than that, if the look of going and staring at the Sermon on the Mount, if the face that's looking back at you is Jesus with a bludgeoning hammer, you're not seeing him clearly. But if you look back through the Sermon on the Mount, you see a compassionate Lord and Savior who frankly wanted the divorce to not be so rampantly wild to protect the women in the first place, because that's what was happening to them, because men were divorcing their spouses to find a woman who came from a better family. If the heart behind all of this is Jesus saying we have to be ruggedly committed to the one that we're committed to, then that's a far different picture than just saying, oh, we got to be committed to marriage. And so I know that we have two problems in the church. Sometimes we're too easy on divorce, and we just let people divorce because, life's hard and divorce is common. That is not appropriate. That is not a moral picture. But at the same time, a higher commitment to marriage rather than the people within the marriage is not what the Sermon on the Mount is saying. And so we have to do a better job of making sure we see Christ looking back at us. Everybody tracking with me? If you use the words of Jesus to beat the snot out of people, you're not using them rightly. I think we can all agree with that. All right, we've got anger, we've got adultery, we've got divorce. And then he gets to this weird one, and he says, don't make oaths. Have y'all ever thought that was so weird? Yeah. He's like, don't swear by anything. And then later Paul's like, I swear by God of heaven, blah, blah, blah. And you're like, what is happening here? Okay, so scaling words. Scaling words are words that everybody ever been like, on the elementary school and somebody's trying to tell you something and it feels far-fetched and you say to them, put that on something, and they say, I put it on my mama. Anybody grow up in an environment like that? So I did. And if somebody said, I put that on my mama, what did that mean, Korea?
If I'm lying, my mom's going to be sacrificed.
That's right. And we all assume you love your mama in that moment. So if somebody said, I'll put it on my mama. Which then you could turn around and say that, put that on your mama. And they go, well, I ain't going to put it on my mama. And then you go, see, I knew you were lying. Okay, here's the thing. The Jewish people of Jesus' day, they use scaling words. In other words, I don't have to be completely honest unless I'm making an oath. And Jesus goes, we're not doing that. You've heard it said, you can, do not break an oath, but fulfill your vows to the Lord, which is what the Old Testament says. I say to you, don't take oaths at all. And you go, what a weird thing. But what he's trying to get at is a better way is you should just tell the truth. Even when you're not under oath, you don't need scaling words. Like if somebody go, put that on your mama, you go, I'll put it on anything. I don't lie. So I don't need to make an oath here. Like I'm not in the habit of lying to you. So I don't need to be in court. To be honest with you, do y'all feel like, this is an interesting thing. We live in a time and age. How many of y'all remember when you used to trust your politicians? How many of y'all now need to see them in court with their hand on their Bible, swearing that they'll tell the whole truth? Because what can the court do if they find out they're lying? Yes.
Extend their trial.
Extend their trial. Well, yeah. A better way than swearing under oath is just to be people of honesty. Just say, I don't need scaling work. Like you, whether I'm in the court or I'm not in the court, whether I'm putting in my mama or not, whether it's in a contract, we're going to be who we say we're going to be, and we're going to do what we say we're going to do. So Scott's really interesting. Scott McKnight, he has an interesting take on this. I don't know that I agree with him. I thought it was fascinating. He says Christians should refrain from participating in oaths today, that we should be conscionable objectors, which means if you go into the court and they say, put your hand on the Bible, do you swear? He should say, he goes literally, you should say to them, I do not participate in systems that encourage dishonesty. This oath is only because people are allowed to lie elsewhere, and I will not participate in a system that allows that to be the normative of a society. And I thought, man, I'm putting my hand on the Bible and just swearing. You know, I mean, like, yeah, I'm not. But Scott says, you know, which Scott is rarely wrong, so this is interesting. But he says, we live this text, this idea, in a world when we live with utter honesty, and we work against systems where dishonesty has become systemic. So Scott would say, if you participate in social media in such a way that you're perpetuating dishonesty, you should not participate in that. That's really fascinating. Like, and so in other words, rather than making oaths and saying, okay, I have to make this oath so that you'll believe me, he's saying we should just be people of honesty. That when someone's dealing with this, they don't feel the need for a contract. Now, I would say get contracts, make sure people, you know, I'm more pragmatic than that. Like, I don't think John should build houses without contracts, personally. But I think he should be able to trust Jen. Like, I think they should live in a world where they don't need contracts. Y'all can work that out amongst yourselves. He goes on, he says, you have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And actually the passage says, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, show no mercy. This is what the Old Testament says. Very interesting. But I say to you, do not resist the evildoer, but whoever strikes you on the right cheek, this is very important, that's the right cheek, turn the other to him as well. And if someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let them have your coat also. And if someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to the one who asks you, and do not reject the one who wants to borrow from you. Okay. In the Old Testament law, there's lex talionis law, which means an eye for an eye. This idea of what you did in kind, we return to you in kind. What's interesting about the Old Testament law code of Israel is that you can really see how everyone's an image bearer. If you take the life of a man, that's the same as taking the life of a woman. Now, we do have the issue of slaves are valued less in the Israeli law code, which is a huge problem. But in other ancient law codes, if you killed a man, that was important. If you killed a woman, less important. You killed a child, not so important. So thankfully, God says, hey, no, human life matters. Then Jesus comes along, and he says, look, if this law code, it did prevent, so y'all, the Godfather, right? The guy comes to him, and what does he ask from on the day of his daughter's wedding? What does he ask of the Godfather? But he doesn't ask for that. He wants vengeance. And he says, you think you're asking for justice. And that the Godfather is like so corrupt, is like the one restraining evil here, which is like, it's supposed to make you laugh. And then you end up with a horse head in your bed. The lex talionis law prevents escalation. Okay? You slap my mom, I'm going to slap your mom twice. You come try to slap, I'm going to beat, this is what humans do, right? We escalate. The Old Testament law says, hold on. We're not going to escalate. Then Jesus comes along, and he calls us to an even deeper commitment to love. Now, I want to be very clear. We, being Christians, have read these texts and encouraged abuse to continue. Jesus says, turn the other cheek. That is not what's happening in these passages. This is not about abuse. This is about someone trying to take your dignity and your desire to return that with retaliation. Slapping the right cheek, most people are right-handed. If I want to slap Jim's right cheek, it's a backhanded slap. That's what's happening here. It's a slap of indignity. I'm not punching him. I'm not beating him. I'm being disrespectful to him. And Jesus says, oh, okay, then don't return it. Don't become like Nika. Give her the other cheek and show her how ridiculous she's being. And then in the ancient code, if I try to sue him for his tunic, which is his undergarment, Jesus says, great, take off your coat too, which means you'll be standing in the courtroom butt naked. He's like, hey, if they want to take your dignity from you, give it to them, and just stand there and be like, really? Is this who you want to be? This is who you want to be. These are really bizarre statements, right? And then he says, and so the Romans could conscript the Jews to walk a mile, which is why, if you've ever noticed that story, where Simon is taken out of the crowd to walk with the cross with Jesus, that's because the Romans could literally be like, you, come here and do this thing. And he goes, if they do that to you, walk a second mile. Can you imagine you're a Roman, you're like, walk with me, and you make them do something, and they keep trailing you, and you're like, we're good. And they're like, no, I'm going to keep going with you. This is what Jesus is saying. One of the themes of the Sermon on the Mount is refusing to comply with a system that is corrupt. We often respond to corruption with what? And Jesus, more corruption. I mean, if someone slapped me in the face, I hope that the first thought that goes through my mind is not beat them. But I'll just tell y'all, a couple years ago, I was sitting at a coffee shop with one of my professors. I was finishing up seminary, and we were at a Starbucks, and these kids ran up and knocked her drink into her lap to distract us. One grabbed my laptop and went that way, and one grabbed my phone and ran that way. And my first thought, I kid y'all not, was I have a sermon on that laptop. Like, I have to go get that laptop back. So I take off running, and I am gaining on this kid. And I remember thinking, what am I going to do when I grab him? And then a getaway car pulled up, and he jumped into it. And he was like, ah! And he's like prepubescent, high-pitched, like scared voice came out. And I thought, that was a pretty nice gift from the Lord to see him truly terrified of me. But I remember thinking later, what a gift that I didn't catch him. Because I think like the adrenaline moment of that and my lack of, I was also like 28 years old and dumb. I don't think today at 39 I would have even thought to myself, I'm gonna punch this kid. But I did think that then. Like I might. And I didn't like that. Like I didn't like that I thought that. And so, I really did spend some time thinking about that and praying about it. But that's what we do, right? You're disrespected, you're harmed, you're whatever, and your first thought is, I'm gonna get you. It's why the Montagues and the Capulets, we keep telling that story. Why? Because we relate to it. How many of y'all have a family situation and you just think, that is so dumb, but nobody's letting it go? Anybody? Yeah, Karen.
So, help me remember, cost of discipleship, what Dietrich Bonhoeffer says on this one.
Oh, yeah, I don't even have to help you remember.
It's pretty impactful as far as, leave that to God.
Yeah.
Rest.
Which is also funny given that he tried to kill Hitler.
It's quite complex.
Here we go. Non-resistant love, Bonhoeffer 132. Hold on, let me make sure I'm getting this right. He says, Jesus releases his community from the political and legal order, from the national form of the people of Israel, and makes it into what it truly is, namely the community of the faithful that is not bound by political or national ties. Be ready for an act of grace in response to that.
Boy, we sure could use that today.
I mean, hold on, number 6. I'll keep reading. Bonhoeffer's always worth quoting. Yeah, this is better. He says, evil will become powerless when it finds no opposing object, no resistance, but instead is willingly born and suffered. Evil meets an opponent for which it is not a match. If someone slaps you and you just go, I'll have another. I mean, not like, but like really. Assuming again, I'm not calling y'all to get beaten. This isn't what he's talking about, but he's saying you're trying, in your response toward me, you're actually hoping for an escalation because you know what? That means it justifies your behavior toward me. But if what you're met with is non-retaliation and love, that's heaping coals on their head. That's when we talk about being kind, that's what's happening there. And I mean, have y'all ever done that where you just unload on someone, don't admit it, but you just like yell at someone and then you're just like expecting them to meet you with aggression, like, ma'am, I'm so sorry that happened. How can we make that right? And you're like,
This isn't fun.
I remember I was so frustrated. I didn't have my contact, I had ordered contact lenses like a while back and they hadn't showed up and they hadn't showed up and they hadn't showed up. And I ordered it from what I thought was a sketchy third party that Alex had told me about. So I thought I was like, I don't know, I thought I was getting taken. So I emailed them a very curt letter. I was like, excuse me, when you say you're going to do something, I expect that, given what I've paid for these contacts. So I would like to know where my contacts are. And the woman very sweetly goes, ma'am, we sent you an email letting you know they were lost in the mail. We immediately shipped out a new set. We're so sorry for the delay. Oh. I had a bad day, and that is no excuse for the way that I wrote to you. Will you please forgive me? I'm so sorry. And I said, she goes, of course, yeah, have a great day. And I just thought, oh my gosh, what is wrong with me? Read all your emails. Yeah. I'm still not going to happen. This is it. If you respond with dignity and non-retaliation, evil has no place to go. Now, are there truly evil people who will keep punching you? Yes. What should you? Get away from them. Get away from them, right? But what you'll also notice here is Jesus was slapped, didn't slap back. Jesus was stripped of his tunic and cloak and coat, and he had to walk all those miles. When you look at this one, what you're going to see looking back at you is the same Jesus who, when the army comes and Pete pulls out the sword and he cuts off the ear, and he's like, whoa, 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 whoa. Nope, this is not the way. And so Bonhoeffer is exactly right. Now, again, this is why these examples are being used. They're not, if what's looking back at you is Jesus with a bludgeoning stick and he's telling a woman who's being beaten by her husband, hey, honey, just turn the other cheek. It's what I did. That is not what this is saying at all. And we should step in and stop that evil from taking place. But if someone is within reason responding to you without dignity and you can withstand that because it's not harming you. And there's levels of harm here, so I want to be careful. This is what Jesus said. We don't fight back. We don't defeat evil with tools of evil. We will never defeat empire with tools of empire. And this is where the Christians got off at 300 with Constantine. They thought, we want to Christianize the whole world, so let's force it legally. What? That's not Christianity. That's empire. And so if you want to defeat evil, you will not defeat evil with evil. You will not drive out darkness with darkness. You will not drive out hate with hate. Finally, don't be pushovers. Amy Jill Levine says this: the slap, the suit, and the subjugation together reveal their import. Do not give up your agency, shame your attacker, and retain your honor. That is a good Jewish scholar's writing for you right there. She's like, we will not go down without a fight, but the only fight is keeping our dignity. So I love that woman. So she would say too, same thing. If someone's truly harming you, like, please get out of there. But in a world of ever increasing acceptable violence, name calling and exclusion, all these things, resist. Resist evil. And how do you resist evil? With love. This is where he's moving all of the extensions up to. You have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. The hate your enemy part, it's not in the Bible. But that's the natural conclusion, right? It's why when the lawyer comes to Jesus, he says, Jesus, can you summarize the whole law? And Jesus says, oh, I don't have to. I know you can. He goes, yeah, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus goes, really good. And he gets ready to walk away, and the lawyer goes, and you know the lawyer has another question. Because lawyers, no, I'm just kidding. Loma's a lawyer. You're not a lawyer? Wait, why did I think you were a lawyer? Oh. You'd make a great lawyer. And the lawyer says, okay, then who is my neighbor? If you're telling me I have to love my neighbor, just tell me who those people are real quick. And what does Jesus say? I have a little story for you. It's called the Good Samaritan. It's actually the merciful Samaritan. We should need, And then he says to him, who was the neighbor? And he won't even say the Samaritan. What does he say?
The one who showed mercy.
Yeah. And they're like, yeah. Jesus is saying to them, look, if you want to be perfect like your God is perfect, then you have to love your enemy. Anybody can love their brother. Anybody can love their neighbor. What it means to have the moral portrait of being my people is that we love even our enemies. And he's talking to persecuted Jews living under oppressive Roman rule. They have immediate enemies. When I ask y'all, who is your enemy? Most of y'all don't have a real person. Do y'all have a mortal enemy?
Not anymore.
Okay, great, yeah. La, 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 I don't want to know, I don't want to know. Need I remind you Need I remind you we're filming this? They had real enemies. Like, they were in enemy-occupied territory. People who sought their harm. And he's saying to them, yeah, you need to love them. Amy Jill Levine says it like this: we still have to love the KKK because if we hate them, we become what they are. And we deny that they are image bearers, which is what they're doing. And she goes, and that's a hard call, but that's what it means to be God's people. The call is nothing short of loving. And so the moral picture of Jesus' own enemy, all of it can be summarized with love. And we don't love discriminately like the scribe and the lawyer wish we did. We love everyone. And so I used to always ask this question. I do it all the time now. Like, I want you to imagine God's like, hey, I'm going to give you a 10-day vacation at the beach, all expense paid, or the mountains, wherever your place is. And you're going to have the whole place to yourself, except one person is going to be there. And you don't get to pick them. And so on the first day, you're going to go, and there's a table between you, and there's a curtain up, and you sit down, and the curtain drops. Who's the one person you don't want to see there? And for some people, they don't have an actual person. Like, some people might think my mother-in-law, right? But some people might think someone who votes a certain way, someone of a different ethnicity, someone of a different faith system, someone, a Longhorn, like whatever, like whoever it is. Steve Sarkeesian. No, I'm just kidding. And that's a funny thing, right? But if you thought about it, like if you had that moment, you go, ooh, wait, oh. And Jesus is going to lean in and go, you're supposed to love them too. And would you see that 10 days as invitation to be the moral picture of God's people? Or would you go, oh, I'd rather not go? Or, you know what, I can spend 10 days with anyone, I'm going to the beach, see ya. The moral picture of Jesus' people, they are people who are peaceful. They're chaste because lust without love is not becoming of God's people. They're loyal. They're loyal to their families and their spouses. And they're honest and they're merciful and they're gracious and they're loving. This is what Jesus is getting at. And so if you walk away from the Sermon on the Mount feeling like you're supposed to be something other than this, read it again. But if you look closely at this, who do you see? Who is the example of it? Yeah, that's exactly right. So, going back into your group, what would it look and feel like? If this is what it was really, if every time you knew you were going to come into a room like this, because we're all Christians, what would it be like if this is really what Christians were like? That we were peaceful people, that we were chaste, that we were loyal, that we were honest, we were merciful and gracious and loving. Hop back into your groups, write down your phrases, and then we're going to put them up on the wall. What would it be like if we actually practiced this? All right, if we ask the question, what would it be like to walk in a room where you knew people were at least striving to be people that were peaceful, chaste, loyal, merciful, gracious, and loving? Shalom, deep rest. Free, with an exclamation point. Y'all know that, like when it's like the little guy that like whips around and I have a pretty good impression of him. I'll show y'all sometime. I was thinking like, anyway, that's what I think of. Sorry. Light, prosperous for everyone. It's a little bit like Acts 2. They shared all they had in common. How far did they get? Comforting, safe, harmonious, welcoming, non-exclusive. What Thanksgiving should feel like. Brokenness of pride, letting go of wrong, vulnerable. I would put the word repentant there, right? Considerate, empathetic, trusting, gracious, alluring, right? It's the same like you. if you're the salt of the earth, this is why we would be attractive, right? Hospitable, safe, low stress, empowering. I like that. Peaceful, equality, love, no fear, no anxiety, substantial. What do y'all mean by that?
We wouldn't be talking about stuff that doesn't matter. We'd be taking care of each other.
How's the weather, Jim? The weather is actually very important to me. So, satisfying, fulfilling, safe, easy, quiet. Quiet. That-
Still.
Oh, okay.
But we were thinking that everyone would be having fun, so it would be kind of loud.
Yeah, I was gonna say. Yeah, it's really interesting. Because I always think like heaven will be loud when I read Revelation, but not.
In a joyous way.
Yeah. Smell like peppermint. Heck yeah.
Yes, I like peppermint. Leave my peppermint back there. Okay. See, yes, exactly my point. I have a bag of peppermint gum in there. Yes.
I love peppermint. Peppermint everything. Yeah. It's what the new heavens are going to taste like. Yeah. Happy and loud. Odd.
It was odd.
It would be very odd. Yeah. Yeah, Larry. I said odd and you raised your hand. You want to talk to anything?
It's not odd for me. It's ironic that John Lennon asked the same question.
You're going to have to help me. I don't know.
Imagine all the people.
Mm.
And he sang basically those things you listed up there. God's put something in all of us to be like that. There's
So,
only one way.
that's exactly right. And here's the thing. The kingdom of heaven is near. This is not just for tomorrow. So, look, are we going to be perfect at this? No. Should this be what we are striving to be? We're reading a book as a staff called Half the Church. And chapter 5 of the book, which we went through tonight, is group identity. This idea of when you're a part of a group, you become, like, the identity of that group becomes a part of who you are. And it asks the question, like, what kind of people are we? And one of the exercises they have is for a group to write down who they want to be. And then they read that out loud. We're people who forgive. We're people who are quick to listen and slow to speak. We're people who value the relationship over, and it's a really interesting, so like if you just take the Sermon on the Mount, we're people who pursue peace and chastity and loyalty and mercy and grace and love. And you just say that over and over again, and you tell your kids, this is the kind of people we want to become. Because this is what it means to be like Jesus. That will form you. And then it doesn't just have to be for tomorrow. You can have peppermint gum today. So what's our so what? First so what is I cannot seem to be on time in this class, so I apologize. I'm going to steal more time from y'all tonight. But most of us aren't going to murder. But what if we really work to be reconcilers? Ministers of reconciliation, as somebody once said. This is a moral picture. It is not a burdensome demand to be placed upon victims. But this is a portrait of the people of God. You all should be ruggedly committed to your spouses. But my goodness, if something breaks, please get the help that you need. Love is the hallmark of God's people, and love is actually hard. The love that is easy is often cheap. And love, often the cost of love is grief. Love is risky. Love is hard. Love makes you foolish. Love makes people in the world say to you, I told you so. You should have never trusted that person. You knew they were that kind of person, and yet we just keep going back. We just keep going back because it's what it means to be Christ, and we just go after people. And do you see the face of Jesus looking back at you? That's what you should see. And he's asking you nothing less than to be like him. That's the goal of the Sermon on the Mount. You want a moral picture of my people? They actually just look a lot like me. And Jesus likes peppermint gum. Let's pray. God, thank you for the Sermon on the Mount. And thank you that when you extend the law, it's not because you are burdensome to us, but it's because you want all of us. And what a gift. When we talked at the beginning of this class that you don't just change our outside, but God, you have the power to change our insides, to make us less anxious and less fearful and more loving and more gracious and less bitter. God, what a gift. We don't want to leave this world just better behavior managers, but we want to be transformed into greater degrees of glory all the time. Help us to be your people. Help us to pursue the morality of this picture, and not because it's burdensome, but because we want more of you. Help us to want more of you. Bless my friends. Keep them safe. We ask this in the name of the Father, Son, and Spirit. And God's people said,